Hello everyone. So in this lecture I'll be talking about externalities, and we'll be covering both negative externalities as well as positive externalities, which can be a byproduct of consumption as well as for production. So the central question or the theme surrounding this lecture is how can we limit climate change? So we all know that climate change is a byproduct of production. It's a negative byproduct, or you can call it a negative externality of production. So how can we limit it? Obviously there have been a lot of discussions about how we can limit climate change. Countries have gathered together to basically decide what can be done and what should be done, how to reduce CO2 emissions, for example, how to basically set up the market for cap and trade. All of these things are different policies which can be used to limit climate change. So the chapter checklist is that at the end of this chapter, you should be able to explain why negative externalities lead to inefficient production and how property rights and pollution taxes can achieve a more efficient outcome. On the other side of it, you should also be able to explain why positive externalities lead to an inefficient underproduction and how different policies such as the public provision of certain goods, subsidies provided to producers, and vouchers provided to consumers can achieve a more efficient outcome. So what is an externality? So let's just define that. Externality is a cost or a benefit that arises from production or consumption. So it's like that part of the cost of production that falls on someone other than the producer. Or if you're talking about the benefit, then it can be said that the part of the production that falls on someone as far as the benefit is concerned, that can be considered a positive externality. So a nice segue into this is that what is the difference between negative and positive externality? A production or consumption activity that creates an external cost is called a negative externality. On the other hand, a production or consumption activity that creates an external benefit is called a positive externality. So, externality can deal with both cost and benefit, and negative and positive externalities can also deal with both the production side and the consumption side. So it's an all-encompassing term, externality. So there are four different types of externalities. There are negative production externalities, there are positive production externalities, there are negative consumption externalities, and there are positive consumption externalities. We'll take a look at each of these one by one. So what is a negative production externality? An example of that, the biggest example of that is pollution. It's a negative byproduct of production. So any sort of noise pollution or congestion or anything of the sort which is a byproduct, which is a negative byproduct of production, can be called a negative production externality. On the other hand, there are also positive production externalities. An example is that orchards provide positive production externalities to honey producers. How does that work? So honey producers want the honeybees to produce honey, and the honeybees basically need flowers to produce honey. So by locating the honey farms very close to orchards, the honeybees can actually use the flowers to make honey, and while they are doing that, the orchard owners can also benefit because it results in pollination between the flowers. So it results, the existence of the honeybee of honey farms close to orchards results in positive production externalities for both the orchards as well as the honey producers. Now, what are the examples of negative consumption externality and positive consumption externality? So, for example, if you are in an indoor space and someone starts to smoke a cigarette, that can cause a negative consumption externality for you, because it's a negative byproduct of someone else's consumption. On the other hand, positive consumption externality would be, the biggest example can be education. So if a lot of people around you are educated, you are probably living in a safer society. You're probably living in a society where everyone is respectful of your opinions. So if I am getting an education, that is resulting in a positive consumption externality for others. Another example can be, and this is a very relevant example these days, so flu vaccination can result in a positive consumption externality, because if I am getting a flu vaccine, I am actually making sure that other people also do not get sick that much. So it's resulting in a positive consumption externality for others. So another distinction that we have to make in the case of negative externalities, and we will be dealing with the example of pollution, the distinction that we have to make is between private costs and social costs. So marginal private cost is the cost of producing an additional unit of a good or service that is borne by the producer of that good or service. On the other hand, marginal external cost is the cost of producing an additional unit of a good or service that falls on people other than the producer. So let's take a look at these two over here. So marginal social cost is the sum of the marginal private cost and the marginal external cost. So in order to actually get an idea of the total cost of production, you should be looking at the marginal social cost, because it also includes the marginal external cost that falls on everyone else apart from the producer of the good or service. So this figure over here shows the distinction between marginal private cost and marginal social cost. So when output is 4 million gallons of paint a month, so this is the supply curve of paint for the producer of paint. So if the output is 4 million gallons of paint a month, the marginal private cost which the producer will be looking at, because that is the cost which the producer will bear, is equal to $1 per gallon over here. So this is denoted by this marginal cost curve, which is blue in color. But at this point of production, which is 4 million gallons per month, the marginal external cost, meaning the cost that is falling on others, is $1.25 a gallon. And this is the gap over here. And if you add that cost to the cost of $1 over here, it will get us to the marginal social cost. So marginal social cost will be indicated by this different curve, which is yellow in color over here. So both start off at the same point, because at a production point of 0, there is neither a marginal cost nor a marginal social cost. But as production increases, the marginal social cost keeps on increasing, because in the case of paint, there is cost on others which is being incurred by the producer, and that cost is in terms of pollution, because paint production causes pollution. So the marginal social cost then becomes $2.25 per gallon at a production point of 4 million gallons per month. So production and pollution, how much should be produced? So when an industry is unregulated, the amount of pollution it creates depends on the market equilibrium price and the quantity of the good produced. But if the industry creates an external cost, the market equilibrium is inefficient and too much of the good will be produced. And just like what you saw in the previous slide, the marginal social cost curve is different than the marginal private cost curve, and when the producers are looking at how much to produce, they are actually just looking at the marginal private cost curve, and that can give us give the producer the wrong idea about how much they should produce, because they will actually be overproducing, not taking into account the cost which is being incurred on others. So this figure shows the inefficiency which arises because of an external cost. So the equilibrium price at the production of 4 million gallons is the price of 1 over here. And that is simply because there is the intersection of our private marginal cost and the demand curve, and wherever these two combine, that will be the production that the producer will want to be at. So the production of 4 million gallons per month, once again, corresponds to a market equilibrium price of $1 per gallon of paint. But what we have to keep in mind is that marginal social cost actually exceeds the marginal private cost and also the marginal benefit. So in this scenario, since the producer is not really taking into account the cost of production which is falling on to others, the efficient quantity should actually be only 2 million gallons of paint, because that is the intersection of the demand curve and the marginal social cost curve. The marginal social cost curve in this case, or in this scenario, is actually giving us a better idea of the total cost of production. So that is why this point of intersection actually gives us the efficient quantity which should be produced. But since the quantity which is produced is 4 million gallons rather than the 2 million gallons which should be produced, this gray triangle area shows us the deadweight lost created by the pollution externality, created because of overproduction of paint, because the producers are not really taking into account the cost which is being incurred on others. So what can be done to fix this inefficiency, which is a byproduct of the overproduction because of not taking into account the cost which is falling on others? So there are 3 classical ways of dealing with externalities that avoid the overproduction. And the first one is to establish property rights. The second one is to mandate clean technology. And the third one is to tax or somehow incorporate a price of pollution into the total price of the product. So the first one is to establish property rights. So externalities will arise naturally because whenever property rights are missing, externalities will naturally arise. Property rights can be described as legally established titles to the ownership, use, and disposal of factors of production and goods and services that are enforceable in the courts. So property rights will work in different ways. So someone has to have the property rights to the resource. So in the example of paint producers, let's just suppose that the paint producers own the homes and the river which are being polluted. So homes are basically situated next to the river, and the river is being polluted because of the production of paint. Let's suppose that is the scenario that we are facing. So the rental income that can be earned on the homes which are situated next to the river depend on the amount of pollution which is being created. So the effect of pollution on rental income will give the paint producers an incentive to limit pollution, because as I pointed out earlier in this example, the paint producers are the ones who are actually owning the homes situated next to the river. So any sort of decrease in the rent because of pollution in the river will basically mean that the money or the rent that the producer of paints are getting is reduced. So as the paint producers are facing this incentive, they might try to limit pollution by either using an abatement technology, meaning any sort of technological advancement which reduces pollution, or they might try to decrease production. So firms will choose the least cost alternative method. So whichever of these two is the most cost effective will be chosen. So what is an abatement technology? An abatement technology is a technology that reduces or prevents pollution. An example in the case of pollution from cars is catalytic converter. So before catalytic converters were invented, every car was actually polluting way more than the cars are doing right now. So now we are turning our attention to the Coase theorem. Coase theorem is a very important theorem or theory basically propagated by Robert Coase, who is a very famous economist. And he basically said that if property rights exist and only a small number of parties are involved in the transaction, keeping in mind that the transaction costs are also low, then private transactions between the parties are efficient and the outcome is not affected by who is assigned the property right. So let's take a look at the practical application of Coase theorem. So sticking to the example of the paint factories causing pollution. So if these paint factories own the homes on the river, the rent people will pay will decrease as the amount of pollution increases. On the contrary, if the homeowners own the river, the factories must pay homeowners for any pollution, and the more the factories pollute, the more they pay. So in both situations, no matter who actually owns the river, who actually owns whoever has been assigned the property rights, it does not really matter, because the paint producers will actually have to pay for the cost of the pollution that they are actually causing to the environment. And that is the simplest interpretation of Coase theorem, that no matter who is assigned the property rights, the producer of the pollution will actually be paying for the pollution that they are causing. So with the property rights implemented, the marginal cost curve that excludes the cost of pollution, which is the one over here, will only show part of the producer's marginal cost. But when the producer actually adds the cost of pollution into its marginal private cost curve, which is now this yellow marginal cost curve, that will actually include the cost of production, and the gap between the previous cost curve, marginal cost curve, and this new one, which incorporates or includes the cost of pollution, shows us what amount of pollution will be caused at each level of production. So the market equilibrium is at price of $1.5 per gallon, which is the intersection of the demand curve and the marginal social cost curve, including the cost of pollution. And at this point, both the marginal social cost and the marginal benefit are equal to each other, and the corresponding quantity at this point is the quantity of 2 million gallons of paint a month. So if this cost of pollution was not really included over here, then you would be looking at an overproduction of 2 million gallons per month to 4 million gallons per month. Governments can also try to mandate clean technology. They can regulate what may be dumped in rivers and lakes and what can be emitted into the atmosphere. The Clean Air Act of 1970 gives the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the authority to actually make their regulations based on scientific evidence, and they can impose those regulations on utilities, chemical plants, and steel mills to limit pollution. Another way of controlling pollution or controlling negative externality would be through taxes and cap and trade, and we will take a look at both of these in the next couple of slides. So with taxes, you can set the tax equal to the marginal external cost so that firms can be made to behave in the same way as they would if they bore the cost of the externality directly. So you're essentially adding the cost of polluting the environment into the cost of production so that firms actually pay that cost when they are producing. So assume that the government has assessed the marginal external cost of pollution accurately. So this is very important, because if the government has not assessed this cost of pollution or the marginal external cost accurately, they won't be able to impose the tax of the right amount on production, and it can still result in overproduction. So let's suppose that the tax has been estimated accurately and the tax is actually levied equal to the marginal external cost at the efficient quantity of paint. So without the tax, the producers will be taking into account their marginal private cost, shown by this curve over here, and they will see where this curve actually intersects the demand curve, and that is the production point that they will want to be producing at. But if the government imposes a pollution tax which gets us to the point where the marginal social cost rather than the marginal private cost is equal to the demand, that is the point where we would like to be at. So if because of this pollution tax, let's see what happens. So what will happen is that because of this pollution tax, we will actually get to this efficient outcome where the marginal social cost is equal to the demand curve. And over here you will see that the production will fall from 4 million gallons per month to 2 million gallons per month. So overproduction will not happen. So if the tax is equal to the cost of pollution, we can get to the efficient outcome where the marginal social cost is equal to the demand curve, rather than the point where overproduction is happening, where the marginal private cost is equal to the demand curve. So once again, just to restate the point, this is the point where the efficient market equilibrium happens, and we can get there because of the tax. And this area, this blue shaded area, becomes the tax revenue which is collected by the government. And it's very easy to see. So the government is basically getting a tax of 1.5 minus 0.9 per unit of production, and the number of units of production is 2 million gallons per month. So if you multiply both sides by each other, you get this area of the rectangle, and that is the total tax revenue collected by the government. So a method apart from the imposition of the tax can be the method of cap and trade in order to control pollution or control the negative externality of production. So cap and trade will place a cap or ceiling on emissions and on any kind of pollution, and it will assign the rights to individual producers who are then free to trade permits. So everyone will be assigned a certain number of trade permits as far as the amount of pollution that they can produce, and firms are basically in a position to actually sell or buy those trade permits or those pollution permits. So in a sense, if you want to produce more and cause higher pollution to the environment, you can actually pay more by purchasing a trade permit from the other producers. Similarly, on the other hand, if you are are polluting less, then you can actually sell the permit that you have to other producers who want to pollute more while producing more. So essentially, it tries to combine the power of the government, because the government is the one who is assigning these trade permits to the producers, but it also takes into account the power of the market, because the free market is essentially functioning because producers can buy and sell trade permits from each other. But in order to make sure that this process works correctly and smoothly, the government must first estimate the efficient quantity of pollution and then set the overall emissions cap to achieve the efficient outcome and allocate the cap to producers. So the market in permits determines the equilibrium price of emissions. So it all depends on how much everyone wants to pollute as a byproduct of production, and that will basically determine the price of emissions, because the price of the trade permit will go up and down based on how much producers want to pollute, how much those trade permits are wanted or in demand by the producers. So by confronting the polluters with the price of pollution, trade in pollution permits can achieve the same efficient outcome as a tax. So just refer to the graph that we used for taxes to avoid negative externalities, and pretty much the same kind of outcome will be seen in the case of cap and trade. So now we turn our attention to positive externalities, and the classic example of positive externality is in the case of education, because if I am educated, I can cause positive externalities for people around me. Similarly, if someone else is educated, I can actually take advantage of the positive externality that that person is generating. So over here we will distinguish between marginal private benefit and marginal external benefit. Marginal private benefit is the benefit of an additional unit of a good or service that the consumer of that good or service receives. So mostly when we are making decisions about how much of a good to consume, we are looking at the marginal private benefit that our consumption will generate. Marginal external benefit, on the other hand, is the benefit of an additional unit of a good or service that people other than the consumer of the good or service enjoy. So as a result of my consumption of a good, a marginal external benefit can be generated, and if I add that marginal external benefit to the marginal private benefit, I will actually get the total marginal social benefit. The marginal social benefit will actually give us a fair and more accurate idea of how much benefit is being generated because of the consumption of a good or service. So this figure shows the existence of an external benefit in the case of education. So the marginal private benefit when 15 million students are getting education is 10,000 per student, as shown by this graph of marginal private benefit. But if you add on the marginal external benefit, let's suppose that marginal external benefit is 15,000 per student. That is the positive externality generated by every student who is actually getting an education. So you have to add that marginal external benefit to the marginal private benefit in order to get to the marginal social benefit. So the marginal social benefit will obviously be shown by a curve which is higher than the marginal private benefit. It just shows that if we are only looking at the marginal private benefit, we are discounting the marginal external benefit which is being generated, and if you add the two, you will get to the marginal social benefit, which is equal to $25,000 per student when 15 million students are getting an education. So the inefficiency which is causing this underproduction is because when the students who are getting education are looking at the benefit which will arise, they are actually looking at the intersection point of the marginal private benefit and the marginal cost curve, and that intersection point will should basically say that 7.5 million students should be getting an education at a price of $15,000 per year. But at this point, the marginal social benefit, which is shown on this curve, exceeds the marginal private benefit and also the marginal cost. So it simply means that we are not at the efficient outcome where the marginal cost is equal to the marginal social benefit, and the efficient production should be 15 million students per year. Rather, we are actually underproducing at only 7.5 million students per year getting an education. So this triangle area shows the existence of a deadweight loss, which is happening because of underproduction, because too few students are enrolling in the college. So how can the government actions resolve this issue of external benefits, meaning taking the market to the efficient outcome where the marginal social benefit is equal to marginal cost? So there are three ways of doing this. The public provision of some goods can happen, meaning if the government actually starts some public universities and colleges, so trying to provide providing education through the public channel, that can be one of the ways in which the marginal social benefit can actually become equal to the marginal cost. Private subsidies are another way to do that, and vouchers are the third way of doing that. A public provision would be the production of a good or service by a public authority. Classic example would be the case of a state university or a state college. A subsidy would be a payment that the government would make to private producers, meaning private universities and colleges might get a subsidy from the government so that the efficient number of students can actually be enrolled every year. And a voucher is a token that the government will provide to households so that they can buy or education for themselves while taking into account the marginal social benefit. So let's take the example of public provision first. So over here, the marginal social benefit equals the marginal cost with 15 million students enrolled in college. So this will be our desired efficient quantity. So how are we getting there though? Because as a consumer of education, what you will be interested in is the marginal private benefit. So this is the equilibrium point that you will be looking at. But what the government is doing is that taking into account this marginal private benefit curve, they are looking at what the price should be charged, or what price should be charged by the government to make sure that 15 million students will get enrolled. And why do they want 15 million students to get enrolled? Because that will correspond to the right quantity which will take us to our efficient outcome where the marginal cost will be equal to the marginal social benefit. So the price that the government should charge, which will get consumers who are looking at the marginal private benefit curve to consume at the quantity of 15 million students per year, is $10,000 per year. So if the government says that the tuition per year is $10,000 per year, the quantity that will be demanded for education would be 15 million students per year would be enrolled. So if the taxpayers cover the rest of the cost of getting an education, we can actually get to the point where we want to be at, the efficient point where the marginal cost is equal to the marginal social benefit rather than the marginal private benefit. So in this example, the taxpayers will have to bear the cost of education, at least in some part, in order for us to acknowledge the positive externality which is generated because of someone getting an education. So a similar kind of outcome, the efficient outcome, can be achieved through private subsidies. So in this example, a subsidy achieves an efficient outcome of 15 million students that we want to be at, because at this point the marginal cost equals the marginal social benefit. So the government will require to provide a $15,000 subsidy per student, because that will actually shift the supply curve to this supply curve over here, where the marginal cost minus subsidy shows the cost to the producer. And it's essentially because this reflects the true cost to the producer, because they are actually getting a subsidy of $15,000 per student. So when you add that $15,000 from any point on this curve, you will actually get to the marginal cost curve. So you can simply see over here that with this subsidy provided, we will be able to get to this efficient outcome of 15 million students per year, because this is the intersection of the marginal private benefit and the MC minus subsidy curve. And at this point, the efficient outcome is reached. And how do we cover the rest of the cost of education? Through subsidies which are being provided by the government. And if you include that subsidy from this point onwards, we will be able to get to the efficient outcome of 15 million students per year with the price of $25,000 per year. Keep in mind that $15,000 out of these $25,000 per year are being provided by the government through subsidies. So the market equilibrium is efficient, and the marginal social benefit equals marginal cost through the provision of this subsidy. The third way that the same outcome can be reached is through the use of vouchers. So with these vouchers, the marginal social benefit curve becomes the demand curve, because essentially households now have vouchers which they can use to pay a higher cost of education. With vouchers, buyers are willing to pay marginal benefit plus the value of the voucher. So now the consumers are no longer looking at just their marginal private benefit curve, because they have extra money in the form of vouchers from the government which they can add on top of this marginal private on top of the marginal private benefit curve, and they can actually get to the marginal social benefit, because this gap over here can be covered with the help of vouchers. So even if the government provides households with this amount of vouchers, which is 25,000 minus 10,000, so if every household gets a voucher of $15,000 which can be used towards getting education, then even at this point of consumption, this gap between the cost can be covered with the help of vouchers, and we can get to this efficient outcome where the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal cost. So price, marginal social benefit, and marginal cost are equal to each other at this point, and the tuition equals the dollar price of 10,000, which will be shown which will be taken from the marginal private benefit curve, but add on top of that the voucher money which the households are receiving, and we will be able to get to the marginal social benefit curve. So how can we limit carbon emissions? We have looked at different ways when we are dealing with the concept of negative externality, and some of the ways that we looked at was taxes and cap and trade. So the problem is that the Earth's average temperature is rising, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is rising, and these figures are actually shown by this graph over here. So the global temperature is also on the rise, global CO2 emissions are also on the rise. So how can we limit carbon emissions? China, US, Europe, all of these countries create about 54% of carbon emissions. But according to the current trends, by 2050, 3/4 of carbon emissions will come from developing countries. So by that time, most of the developed countries will be moving more and more towards cleaner sources of production and energy, but on the other hand, developing countries will take up more of the role of carbon emitters. So on current trends, by 2100, the temperature will have increased by 3 degrees Celsius, and that kind of temperature change will bring extreme weather and widespread coastal flooding. And so there is definitely a cause for concern, because this is a race for survival as far as humanity is concerned. So how can we limit carbon emissions? So some economists, including Nicholas Stern, are of the opinion that we have really been late to have a crackdown on carbon emissions, and he basically terms it the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. And he proposes that if we want to ensure our survival and survival for the next generations, we need to really act on the issue of climate change seriously and stop emitting pollutants into the environment. And because of the position that economists such as Stern have taken, the UN Climate Change Conference has basically agreed on a number of things to reduce carbon emissions, and they want to limit greenhouse gases. They want to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. They want rich countries to pay $100 billion a year to help poorer countries move towards cleaner sources of energy. And they also want to review each country's voluntary contribution to cutting emissions every 5 years, so that they can keep a check and balance on every country separately. So if carbon emissions are to be cut, or the amount of pollutants into the environment has to be reduced, incentives must change, because producers, consumers, every one of us responds to incentives. So the cost of carbon emitting activities must increase, and they can be increased because through different ways, and we have already looked at some ways in this chapter, in this lecture. They can be, carbon emissions could be taxed, or they can be capped with the help of cap and trade. And also another way of looking at it would be to invest more in clean energy and developing new green technologies which can be subsidized by the government. So this graph gives you a quick idea of how much lower taxes are paid by US citizens compared to UK citizens as far as the gasoline taxes are concerned. So why are there higher gasoline taxes in UK? So it's basically to kind of get us to the efficient outcome where we are not overproducing gasoline or fossil fuels. So why is not more being done? Why are we not taking a harder stance on climate change and pollution? The top 4 reasons for this is that developing economies want low-cost energy and coal is an attractive choice for them. So in order to get the major segment of the population out of poverty in developing countries, they still need to develop at a good growth rate. They still need to produce more goods and services, and if those production of goods and services wants to be competitive, an easier choice is to basically go with the cheaper route of production while not taking into account the number of pollutants which are being emitted into the environment. Another reason for this is that getting global agreement is hard, and once again the dynamics between developed and developing countries is given those dynamics, it's hard to get a resolution on how much emissions is the efficient amount of emissions. Another reason for why not more is being done is that costs are certain and are borne now while most of the benefits come in the future. So the cost of moving to renewable energy sources is a cost which is really high right now, but the benefits of that change will come in the future, because this generation will not probably see the benefits of that, but the future generation will reap the benefits of the cost of moving to cleaner sources of energy. And the final reason for why not more is being done is that technology is advancing and the cost of cleaner energy is falling. So a temptation is to rely on this trend continuing. So it simply means is that producers are taking a wait-and-see approach to this, meaning they want the costs of cleaner energy to keep on falling, and when they actually become lower or equal to the cost of the current sources of energy, they will actually move towards those cleaner sources of energy. But now they are basically taking a wait-and-see approach, and they really don't want to invest in these cleaner energy sources right now because the costs are high. Finally, now we have to look at the other side of things. So there are other economists and experts such as Born Lomborg, who actually say that maybe we should not try to protect the environment that much, because his exact quote is that for little environmental benefit, we could end up sacrificing growth, jobs, and opportunities for the big majority, especially in the developing world. And that is a big concern in developing countries, because if they are told by global organizations or by developed countries that, hey, you cannot go ahead and produce the same way that we did, and you cannot progress, you cannot develop your economy the same way that we did, it can cause resentment, because they will have to move to expensive sources of energy, and while doing that, there's a greater chance that they will no longer be competitive in the production of goods and services, which ultimately means that they will not be able to pull a greater segment of their population out of poverty. So this lecture was on externalities. I hope you guys had a good time listening to this lecture, and it added to your knowledge of positive as well as negative externalities. Let me know if you have any questions, and see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.